Hi there, folks. So we're back with our second lecture of today, and right now we're going to be talking about the New York Times article we were reading for class this week. That Should Prostitution Be Legal by Emily Bazelon. I think it's actually a fascinating article. It's a long read, but it really lays out the arguments for why prostitution, why sex work should be legalized or should be kept in basically the same status it has now, where it is in a generally not legal. Where or moving towards what you might think of as the Nordic model or the Swedish model, where it becomes illegal to buy sex work but not to sell sex. So it raises a lot of questions. I think one of the nice things it does is lay out all the different ways in which different countries have dealt with this question. So of course there's this Swedish model of having sex work itself decriminalized, while still criminalizing men who solicit sex work. And as you know, for the purpose of this lecture, we are referring to sex workers mostly as female and the people who buy sex work as mostly male. I know that's not exclusively true, but it is certainly the modal outcome. And so just for simplicity's sake, we might refer to sex workers, we might refer to the men who solicit them. Of course, we're acknowledging that it's not always men and sex workers aren't always women. Okay, regardless, and talks about all these different models we have, right? You've got, in addition to the Swedish model, which has been fairly widely adopted in Northern Europe, even in Canada, we also have the German model, right, which has basically made it legal and regulated. We've got the Indian model, which is fascinating because, of course, we've been talking mostly about this from the perspective of Western, relatively wealthy European countries. In fact, India has come with some sort of solution to this. I think it's actually a very interesting adaptive solution where they have basically created unions of sex workers, and basically their strength in numbers, they've been able to kind of pool the resources and pool political power and economic power in order to try and protect sex workers in India. But there's some context that I think that's missing to the article that I'd like to try and add back here. And a lot of this has to do, two main topics I want to cover within the time we have here. The first, I want to talk about the relationship between feminism and sex work. And they lay that, Emily Bazelon does a pretty good job laying that in the article, but I want to spend a little more time on that because I know you might not have the background. She talks about people like McKinnon and Dworkin in the article, and I think it'd be good to talk a little bit more about their views and understand where they're coming from. The other thing that I want to talk about is the barriers to decriminalization of sex work in the United States. No, I don't want to take a side here. I don't think there's a reason for me to. I want you to understand the issues rather than me give you an idea of how I think about this. But the United States, regardless of what the benefits to decriminalization or harms to decriminalization will be, it's unlikely we're going to move towards decriminalization in the U.S. anytime soon. And I think it's important for us to talk about exactly why that is. All right, so let's start by talking about this weird relationship between feminism and sex work. So in the article, Bazelon talks about two Canadian scholars, feminist scholars, McKinnon and Dworkin, who are very influential in modern feminist views of sex work and of the relationship between men and women in general. McKinnon and Dworkin are considered to have relatively extreme views on the subject, notwithstanding the fact that they've been very influential in law, especially in Canada, has been largely shaped by the views of people like McKinnon and Dworkin, and them specifically. So McKinnon and Dworkin essentially look at all of society as being patriarchal. That is, that society in general is anti-women and is run by men who are dominating women. And so they say, well, that means that society in general is forcing women to do things they don't want to do. And, there's something to be said for that, right? Of course, we live in a society where women are paid less than men for the same amount of work, right? For the same work, depending on what you want control for, women are paid somewhere between 10 and 20% less than men are. So if that's the case, women are getting less money than men, and women wind up more likely than men to wind up in situations where they are economically dependent on men. So if women are economically dependent on men and men want to have sex with the women, it certainly makes it seem like that those women kind of have to do it, that they don't really have a choice. So they might be subject to penalties, or maybe men won't support them or take care of them if they don't provide sex. They might also be subject to physical violence. There's certainly plenty of relationships where women would be beaten, would be harmed in some way. And so if men have all the economic and social power, and they can use that, maybe not individually, but McKinney could argue on a collective basis, to extract sex and extract other labor from women. In their view, this would mean that basically all heterosexual sex is what amounts to either sex work or rape, that women don't really have a choice in the matter, but whether they want to engage in these things or not. They're doing it without choice, and so because of that, it's really out of their control, and it is immoral. So they would argue, perhaps, if we take the argument to their extremes, that basically the only sex that is truly consensual in a patriarchal society is homosexual sex between women. So that, of course, is a relatively extreme view, and this actually has led McKinney and Dworkin to push. Well, not anymore. One of them is dead. It led them to argue for not just bans on sex work, but also for bans on things like pornography. So they're the big arguments. It's this sort of very radical feminist view. It's going to argue that not just sex work, but also pornography should be outright banned. That pornography is essentially rape. And if it's not directly rape, it's indirectly rape, and so it should be done away with. And so you're going to see places like Canada are going to have much more strict laws about pornography than we do in the United States because they've embraced this sort of view. So on one hand, we have this view that sex work, perhaps even pornography, is really a symptom of a patriarchal society where women don't have agency. Women can't do anything. And if women are choosing to engage in sex work, then they're not really choosing. They may think that they're choosing, but in reality, they're subject to all these social forces that are pushing them into it. And so even if they think they're choosing it, they're not really, really choosing it. So as a result, the idea is, number one, it should be illegal, of course, because they say this is essentially violence against women. This is the equivalent of rape. So it should be outlawed. But it also, on the other hand, views the women as victims. So if the women are victims, of course, you wouldn't want to punish them. In any sort of crime, we don't punish you for being the victim of a crime. But we do want to keep it illegal. And that's the sort of thinking that gets us to the Nordic or Swedish model. The idea that, well, we know it's bad, we want to ban it, and we're going to try and discourage it as much as possible. And the way to discourage it, of course, is to outlaw it, make it illegal. But we also are saying that women are victims here. And if women are victims, well, then you can't put them in jail for it. Rather, what you should do is try and provide treatment, try and provide services to them so they can get out of that life. Because the idea is that it is necessarily bad for women to be sex workers. So that's an interesting point of view because on one hand, we're trying to protect women, okay. But on the other hand, it's denying women agency. It's saying women cannot possibly choose this occupation. And of course, feminism mostly is arguing for women to have a great deal of agency, saying women should be able to do whatever they want, should choose whatever occupation they want. But they're saying, well, but not that occupation. Because this occupation, you choose to be a sex worker, then you don't actually have agency. You might think you have agency, but you don't actually have any real agency there. So this means that there is something of a divide in feminist groups. So on one hand, you have abolitionists, like McKinney and Dworkin, and like really most American feminists, I would argue, regarding that prostitution, sex work is necessarily bad. And as a result, it should be banned. And at the very least, should be moving towards a Nordic model. But the goal should be to end sex work, right? So sex work is inherently victimized women, and you should end it. On the other hand, and I think this is represented in Bazelon's article by the activists that you hear in the activists that Bazelon talks to, that they're going to argue that no, that's not actually the case, and they're going to argue that women actually can express their agency, can be independent through sex work. That women could reasonably and plausibly choose to work as sex workers because it's better than the other jobs available to them. And so, if women are choosing to be sex workers, we shouldn't be undercutting that experience. We shouldn't be telling them, well, that's not a real decision or you didn't really choose it. I mean, we wouldn't do that for any other job. We wouldn't say, well, you don't really want to be a waitress. Being a waitress is a terrible job. People treat you badly. The hours are long. You're on your feet the whole time. It's a bad job. But we would never say to women, well, you don't really want to be a waitress. We should ban waitressing because waitressing is exploitative, which it kind of is, right? I mean, you have to pretend to be nice to people in order to get tips. It's exploitative. It's a hard job. It's a bad job. But we would never say to women, well, you don't really want it, and we should ban waitressing because it is a bad job. So they're going to argue, no, it's part of our agency. We should be pushing, there's no reason to push women out of sex work. The thing we should do is make sure that sex work is protected. The problem with sex work is that because it is illegal, because it is marginalized within society, that leads sex workers to be the victim of crimes at a much greater rate than they otherwise would be. And that's the problem, the fact that they're victimized is the problem rather than the fact that they're in this occupation to begin with. So they would argue there's nothing inherent in sex work that makes women victims. Rather, what we have to do is we have to take the victimization out of it. It certainly is the case, and everyone's going to agree that procurers, pimps, are victimizing women. So we should just get rid of them. And if we get rid of them and get rid of the violence that often accompanies sex work, and the police violence and the violence from the men who are buying the sex work, if we get rid of that, then women aren't victims anymore. And so those are things we need to be banning. Those things we need to get rid of. So they would argue that what you need to have is full legalization. So rather than abolitionism, they're going to say you need to have regulation. So you need to legalize it. You need to put it in places where it can be easily monitored. And then once you have that, you need to once the sex workers are no longer kind of in the shadows, then it's going to be possible for them to report crimes to the police. After all, there's a reason you don't go to a restaurant and not pay your bill. Or if the server brings you your bill, you don't beat the server up and leave, right? Because if you did, they'd call the police. So perhaps the reason why people do that to sex workers is that they know they believe the sex worker isn't going to call the police. So therefore, well, if we just legalize it and make the police take it seriously, then you don't have a problem anymore. Then the women aren't going to be victims anymore. And the reason we have such a divide, well, this is really a philosophical divide, is because it's between feminists who are arguing women don't have agency, women are inherently victims, and feminists arguing that women do have agency. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, because if you're a feminist, especially an activist feminist, you're going to argue, of course, women have agency. But they're saying, well, not in this case. And so I think that's why you get this big divide. I think also we need to acknowledge that there are real differences between the abolitionists and the folks arguing for legalization and regulation. And this is, I think Bazelon does a reasonable job of pointing this out in the article, that the big differences really are about race and class. That is, the women who are arguing, the sex workers who are arguing for legalization and regulation are much more likely to be white rather than people of color, when, of course, when it seems like, especially in the article, many sex workers are, in fact, people of color. Sex workers are disproportionately people of color. They're more likely to be cisgendered rather than trans. So in many ways, they're much more privileged. They have more money or earn more money. At the very least, they're going to be people who are able to present themselves as social capital, to present themselves in a way that is more appealing to society. So it makes sense that they would think that they've got a degree of agency that perhaps other sex workers wouldn't. And perhaps it is the case that they do have a degree of agency, right? Maybe the problem here is that we're treating sex workers as one group, when there's a lot of variation there. There are sex workers who don't have agency, who are participating in the trade because they're addicted to drugs, or they need money, or they have no other options, or their boyfriends are forcing them to. And then there might be other women who are participating in sex work because it's enjoyable and it pays well. And we can imagine there are differences. And now, of course, the article starts off with this idea of a sex worker named Meg Munoz. And Ms. Munoz starts off as doing it out of agency, we might say. She's doing it because it's fun and she's getting a lot of money, and then winds up kind of being stuck in it and having a man dictating what she's doing. So the lines between those two might not be as easy as we'd like. And it's not clear that we should be treating all sex work as being the same. And one thing that we've seen the Nordic model do is really create or more clearly define what those lines are. So when in the Nordic countries, when they've put these policies in effect, they notice is not that the number of sex workers decreased, but rather the number of arrests for sex work decreased. And that's largely because sex work was forced off the streets where it's easily regulated, where the police can drive by, and into private homes and into hotels, and basically to online ads where it's less likely to be seen. So perhaps that makes it safer and makes women less likely to be, sex workers be less likely to be the victims of crimes. But as the article points out, also in theory could push them to more remote places, less public places, where men might feel, the men who are soliciting sex might feel more comfortable attacking them or committing crimes. So it's not at all clear. So I want to bring up that divide within feminist movements and point out that there's not necessarily, the dominant thread in America, I think, still is towards abolitionism. But it is uncomfortable because abolition necessarily means you're denying to some extent the agency of sex workers and of women involved in this trade. The other thing I want to talk about in our time we have here is the barriers to decriminalization in the United States. So some of these are talked about in the article, right? The idea that the Nordic model, we have trouble doing that in the US because Nordic model, the idea is, we arrest the men who are soliciting sex, and then we try and get treatment or help for the women who are involved in the sex, women who are the sex workers. The problem is, in Nordic countries, they've got plenty of services, right? They can put them in shelters, they give them social services, they can get them basically free college, free education. So there's lots of services. In the United States, we don't have those services, right? We don't have strong social services. And as a result, it's not clear if we actually could, if we said, we're going to get treatment for these women, it's not clear what sort of treatment we would actually be able to get. And that's one barrier. And I think that is linked to the fact that sex workers are mostly from disadvantaged groups like women of color and SOGI minorities, SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identities. We're talking about women who are trans or other ways, not cisgendered heterosexual women. So the fact that we've got these marginalized groups makes it even harder for them to get treatment because these are groups that are traditionally marginalized and disadvantaged in American society, so they're going to have less resources. And so it's not the opportunities are not necessarily going to be there for us to get them into treatment. And it's not clear that society in general would support expanding resources if they think the primary beneficiaries of that expansion are going to be people who are transgendered people, or going to be people who are African American or Latinx or whatever. So the fact that we have problems with racism and with discrimination against SOGI minorities means it's going to be harder to convince the public to support programs in order to help sex workers. There's also a fear among some feminist groups that sex work under regulation will become corporatized. And we've seen this happen to some extent in Germany, where basically, because it's heavily regulated, which is what you'd want, because it's heavily regulated, it's become the province of basically large corporations, right? It's not mom and pop shops. They can't afford all the regulation. And so as a result, you have these huge corporations that are running brothels. And it's not clear that that's way better, right? Because we're talking about the ideas to preserve women's agency, working for a giant corporation in a job doesn't necessarily preserve your agency. Now, it's probably better than the way they do it in places outside of Las Vegas in Nevada, where you do have areas where sex work is legalized and brothels legalized, but the brothels are generally small, and they're not very good at protecting women's rights either. I mean, the women who were in there in the article describe them as being somewhere between a summer camp and a women's prison. So the corporatization of it, and of course, if for a feminist group, this is also a problem because the corporations will be dominantly run and owned by men, just means, basically you're taking pimping or procuring to another level. It's not clear that that's great. Other things that are driving it, that are driving the opposition to decriminalization in the US, a big one is NIMBYism. That is, even when people agree that in general, sex work should be decriminalized, they don't necessarily want to decriminalize where they live. So if I think, sex work should be decriminalized in theory, that doesn't mean I want brothels in my town. I want brothels somewhere where sex work can be, there and be legal, but I don't want it here. We call this NIMBYism. So NIMBY is an acronym, stands for Not in My Backyard, NIMBY. And I think that's a big barrier here. So when we had, for instance, San Francisco is one of the most liberal cities in the country, and they had a referendum on whether sex work should be legalized, and it lost in huge margins. And I don't think that was necessarily because of opposition to sex work being legalized. Well, there's certainly some of that. I said there's a divide in the feminist movement on this. But rather it's because, we don't want it here, right? If we could have a bill to have sex work legalized somewhere else, cool, we'll be all about that. But I don't want it here because of fears it's going to lead to higher crime rates. It's going to lead to decreased property values. It's going to lead to drug abuse. It's going to lead to all these problems. I don't want that happening here. There's also a lot of religious opposition. So in the United States, we are much more religious as a country than most other developed states, right? More Americans go to church. More Americans have deeply held religious views than you're going to find in places like the UK or Germany or the Netherlands or Sweden. And I think that's also a problem here, right? That a lot of the opposition to prostitution being legalized, sex work being legalized, is not necessarily coming from an economic standpoint or from a feminist standpoint, but from a religious standpoint. The belief, deeply ingrained, deeply held, deeply felt belief that sex is somehow dirty if it's done outside of consensual relationships within a heterosexual marriage. And since sex work necessarily is not done within those confines, that makes it intrinsically bad from the sort of moral or religious point of view. And I think that's a barrier here, the idea that sex work is still very heavily stigmatized. And I think we actually see a parallel here between this and the immigration arguments we've been having, the immigration discussion we've been having, where the opposition to immigration, the arguments we're making are much more economic than anything else. But people don't see it as an economic issue; they see it as an emotional issue, see it as a moral issue. But what's right and wrong and what's good for my culture. Much more than is this actually economically sensible what we're doing. And so I think we need to bear all that in mind. So the things, even if we have solutions seem to be working well in Norway or even Canada or Australia or New Zealand, I'm not sure we think they would work well in the United States. Now, that's not a reason you shouldn't try. That is, if sex work should be legalized, if it would help everybody, then it's incumbent on us to do that. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that we need to have cultural change first. So end the stigmatization of sex work, create the social services you need, and then you can end it. But we do run something of a chicken and egg problem there. That is, if you want to destigmatize it, the way to do that is to expose it to more people, have it out there. We should note that in the history of the United States, it's only really in the 20th century that sex work has been largely criminalized, even though it was illegal in most of the United States for most of the existence of the United States. It's not everywhere. And even though it was legal, it was illegal. It was quasi-legal, and then it was still widely used. If we can go back to as recently as the 1930s. As recently as the 1930s, about 1/3 of all men had their first sexual encounter in a brothel. The numbers, of course, much, much lower now. But, your great-grandfather probably had, it's a very good chance your great-grandfather had sex for the first time with a prostitute. And that was normalized. So it was perhaps stigmatized to some extent, especially on religious grounds, but was somewhat normalized. And perhaps that sort of normalization is what can lead to the destigmatization, which can lead us to be able to embrace something closer to the Nordic model or the Australian or New Zealand model. All right. That's about enough time on this for now. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you again soon.